Hello, hello, and welcome. We'll let folks trickle in and sign on. We're so glad that you're here. Thank you for being here. Welcome all, welcome friends and comrades and colleagues and an audience that cares about the moment that we're in, about marking an unacceptable anniversary. We're so grateful that you are choosing to spend the time with us. And for those that are watching on live stream, wherever you are, we hope that you are safe and well. This is a tumultuous time, and it often is when we are meeting. But welcome, however you are and wherever you are. We're honored by your presence. My name is Nadia Ben Youssef. I use she and her pronouns. I am the advocacy director at the Center for Constitutional Rights, one of the organizations that has organized this event and is welcoming you to this space. I have the honor of moderating what I think will be an extraordinary panel of activists and scholars and thinkers, people who have taught me so much about what it looks like to resist, what it looks like to imagine a different world. And I hope that even as we're talking about a brutal and cruel history, that you will also feel inspired by the seeds that are planted for the world that we deserve. This is a webinar called Migrants and Muslims at Guantanamo, a history of demonization, social control, and resistance. Before we get started, and I situate the conversation a bit in the moment, a few housekeeping ideas to keep in mind. So this is being live streamed and recorded. So you'll be seeing this on all sorts of platforms: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And we're hoping that this space can be kept respectful and invite you to show up with all of your integrity and curiosity. We want you to ask questions. We have an awesome stage manager who's going to be monitoring the chat on these various platforms for questions, and there'll be time at the end to ask and answer. We're really grateful to have ASL interpretation. So thank you to all hands in motion who are here with us today. There is also a live transcription. So if folks want to follow along in writing, there is a link to click on. It's called TypePad, I believe. And you'll see that in the, or Typewell. So you can access the live transcription there. I think that's it. We'll be speaking slowly for the interpretation. And again, welcome your questions and your thoughts. We're also going to be putting some resources into the chat, so follow along, and we hope that there will be a lot there that we speak about and that you can follow up and read on your own later. So the conversation, it's happening, 5 days until the end of the Biden administration, before the start of Trump 2. These are really crucial times, and there will be an opportunity for us to take action because there is still swift steps that can be taken in the last 5 days of the Biden administration. Again, January 11th marked 23 years since the opening of Guantanamo Bay, which is an opening and actually a repurposing of the prison to house Muslim and men and boys who were captured in the war on terror. We're also months after Biden signed a massive contract to maintain the Migrant Operations Center, where the US government continues to detain migrants in unknown circumstances, as it has since the 1990s. And so when the organizers came together to think about what do we do on this anniversary, 23 years? How do we tell this story? We wanted to explore the history and evolution of this place. both to look back at lessons learned, to understand the logics of Guantanamo, but also to think about how it may transform and what will be required of us in the future. This is a place where successive US administrations have attempted to evade and manipulate the law. Guantanamo is a devastating material reality, and it is also a symbol of dehumanization, an emblematic example of our society's warped vision of safety and security. And so today, we also come with remarkable and hopeful news. And many of you who have journeyed with us saw the news last week that 11 men were transferred to Oman. And it should be, as difficult and complicated as we feel as we look at how possible it is to transfer men. We have to commit to confronting what made Guantanamo possible, what makes it possible that there are 15 men remaining, that their fates are unknown, but also that it requires all of us to commit again and again to challenging its existence, to demanding its closure. And we'll be doing that together, and you'll be hearing from our panelists about how you can continue to engage now and for whatever is to come. I think what we do know is that in the 23 years, a movement has been created, a movement that refuses to be indifferent about what is happening at Guantanamo, across movements, across communities. So you'll hear that here from incredible panelists, and I'm honored to briefly introduce them. And although they require much longer introductions, I will say that you are in for a treat, and you will learn a lot today. So first, Mansoura Daifi is a writer, an artist, a human rights advocate, and former prisoner who spent over 14 years at Guantanamo Bay prison camp without charge or trial. He's a writer, the co-founder of the Guantanamo Survivors Fund, a remarkable advocate and friend and comrade. So we're so glad you're here, Mansour. Eric Crew is a staff attorney at Haitian Bridge Alliance, and he now leads Haitian Bridge Alliance's impact litigation docket and their work in the international legal fora. I may also say that he was a former intern at the Center for Constitutional Rights. We're so glad that you're here, Eric. Dr. Maha Hilal, a Muslim Arab American expert on institutionalized Islamophobia, the war on terror, and counter-narrative work. Maha is a longtime comrade of CCR's and a co-organizer of this event, and we're so grateful for your leadership, Maha. And also just want to pitch a book that you all should be reading and should have read, called Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. One of her many writings, and I hope we'll actually put a bit more of recent writing in the chat for you all to read too. And finally, last but not least, Jessie Franzblau is the Senior Policy Analyst for National Immigrant Justice Center's DC-based policy team, also a writer and thinker, and really looking forward to hearing more about your work in the context of migration and immigration policies. So thank you, Jessie, for being here. Thank you to all the panelists. Before we dive into some questions, I'm actually going to turn it to you, to the panelists, so that the audience can learn a little bit more in your own words. What brings you to this conversation? And maybe, is there a particular question or hope that you want to share with the audience before we dig in? I'm going to start with Mansour, then Eric, then Jessie, and then Maha. So Mansour, what brings you to this conversation? What would you like the people to know? Thanks.
First of all, a piece of greetings from Yemen. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يا هلا ومرحبا رحبا حياكم الله أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا مليون. From Guantanamo to Sana'a to Gaza. Gaza will be free and Palestine will be free. First of all, thank you so much for the introduction. And I would like to welcome you all, panelists and viewers and listeners whatsoever. So what brings me here? I'd like to be here every single day. We need to keep the fight. We need to keep resistance. You know, like this time is a time of resistance. That's it. So what brings me to here today, what I'd like to talk about is, you know, as you know, Guantanamo has turned the 23rd year of the, I'm not going to say anniversary because it's not an anniversary. I can say 23 of opening of the dark hole in Guantanamo. So it is really important for us to keep advocating, to keep spreading the truth about Guantanamo, what Guantanamo is about. Guantanamo is a place that becomes symbol of injustice, lawlessness, and abuse of power. You know, and say again, repeat the question, please. I got distracted with my shouting.
It's never a distraction. It really is whether you have a question or a hope that you want to share with the audience about this theme of, you know, the detention of migrants, of Muslims at this place.
You know, like Guantanamo history doesn't start at the January 2002. It started even before that with the Haitians and so on. It's continued targeting migrants. As you know, reports came out that between around 500 migrants were detained in Guantanamo since 2002, I think, or 2003. And in similar circumstances to the prisoners at Guantanamo. So we are going to talk also maybe in a little while about why Guantanamo was created, that place, why choosing Guantanamo specifically, and what's the future of Guantanamo, because why Guantanamo is one of the biggest human rights violations in the 21st century, and what's the future of Guantanamo, and why we focus should be more on Guantanamo. It's not in Guantanamo, it's the system that created Guantanamo, because my fear is, for my work on Guantanamo case, that Trump is going to create more Guantanamos within the United States, especially if he start implementing the deportation plan he has for the undocumented migrant, as he suggested in 2019 that undocumented migrants should be classified as enemy combatant and, you know, sent to Guantanamo. I don't want to talk more on that. We're going to talk more about this. I just want to say about this time, we need to speak out. We need to continue the fight, because, as you know, 4 administration so far failed to close the Guantanamo. What I believe, they are committing a crime by keeping Guantanamo open.
Thank you, Mansour. There's richness there already that I want to follow up on. Eric, the same question to you. You know, what brings you to this conversation, and is there a particular question or hope that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, thank you, Nadia and Mansour, for what you shared. I am so thankful to be here having this conversation. You know, a lot of my life has been about exploring sort of borders and limits and race and identity and how all these things kind of come together. I was born in the United States in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a Black father and a white mother. My Black family came up through slavery in South Carolina. My white family came up as Irish immigrants. And, you know, very early, I could see how state systems were using incarceration, other kind of things to divide people. And so, you know, in my professional life, I have spent a lot of time in U.S. prisons helping people with human rights violations in U.S. prisons, and then went on to explore the international space and worked in Haiti with a human rights law firm there. And, you know, again, the questions that I want to explore are the same ones with all this I've been exploring like my whole life and professional career is like, how are the oppression of different communities connected? And what kind of connection can I make today or after this webinar that I couldn't make before? For example, between what someone in a neighborhood in Port-au-Prince is experiencing right now to a neighborhood in the West End in Cincinnati to a neighborhood in Gaza. What connection can I make between what they're experiencing there and the systems that are operating? You know, same thing that we say out on the streets. Who do you protect? Who do you serve? Is there a common actor behind any of this stuff? So it's really, I'm really grateful to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for that, Eric. The same question to you, Jesse. Welcome. What brings you here? A question or hope that you have that you want to share with the audience?
Thanks so much, Nadia, and really incredibly happy to be here, and much gratitude, Eric and Mansour and Maha here. And so I'm a senior policy analyst with the National Migrant Justice Center, and just to give a little background on my organization, because my organization has done a lot of work around the protection of asylum seekers and refugees. So my organization for around 3 decades has been dedicated to ensuring human rights protections and access to justice for immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. Serves around 11,000 low-income individuals a year and advocates for these populations. And I do a lot of work focusing on our transparency work and have sought to gain access to information related to the Migrant Operations Center, which is located on the naval base and on Guantanamo Bay, that holds people in detention who are interdicted at sea. That we'll get into a lot, but this MOC, the Migrant Operations Center, is really it's been really marked by secrecy, a real lack of transparency. It's a absolute stain on U.S. asylum law. It should completely be defunded and closed out. It's been completely entrenched in the racism and xenophobia that led to its creation decades ago that we'll be discussing quite a bit. And so it's really this fight to gain access to information about this detention facility as part of our broader efforts to gain access to information to how immigrant communities are treated in this country, and to pierce the secrecy around ICE detention, and in order to be able to fight back and push back against the use of immigration detention and immigration enforcement programs that we will certainly be fighting back against increasingly this coming administration. And in terms of questions to share with the audience, I'm just excited to be here with other experts and deep thinkers and advocates working across lines. So I think this cross solidarity organizing is really pivotal. Issues related to anti-militarism and to defend the rights of immigrant communities is really pivotal at this time. So I'm really just excited to be here.
Appreciate you, Jesse. Thank you so much. Maha, your self-introduction, what brings you here, and a hope that you have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nadia, for moderating, and thank you to Jesse, Eric, and Mansour for agreeing to be on the panel. This is an event I look forward to every year because we've been organizing it with the Center for Constitutional Rights and Amnesty International, and now we're glad to have 2 extra comrades with us from the National Immigrant Justice Center and the Haitian Bridge Alliance. So I am the executive director of Muslim Counterpublics Lab, and our work really focuses on dismantling and disrupting problematic narratives that are designed and deployed to justify state violence against Muslims. So a lot of the ways I come into that work is from a narrative perspective, and looking at how the men and boys at Guantanamo have been so thoroughly demonized and dehumanized that their exclusion has not only been made possible, but has been rendered acceptable and has garnered very little pushback over the years. The place that I also come into this work from is in 2007, when I was doing my master's in counseling, I did an internship at Amnesty International in what was then called the Denounce Torture Initiative. And that was actually the first introduction to me about Guantanamo Bay. And it was that experience that I learned that in the current iteration of the War on Terror, that it was a prison that was designed to house an exclusively Muslim male population. As a young Muslim, that was deeply devastating to me and was really a catalyst for my politicization and understanding of how the War on Terror operated and had operated and would be operating, and particularly in its rootedness in Islamophobia. Now, when I was first learning about Guantanamo, of course, I never learned about the fact that it had been used as a place to house Haitian and Cuban asylum seekers. Because in this country, right, not only are we fed propaganda, but simultaneously there is an active production of ignorance. So I had never learned about the history of Guantanamo. And so when I first started talking about Guantanamo, advocating for the closure of Guantanamo, and learning about the men who've been detained, I thought it was a total anomaly. And it was only years later, right, that I learned about the history of this place, how insidious the history has been, and how exclusionary it has been. And now, in the past few years, why it is so important for us to come together as different communities, right, to really think about how do we close Guantanamo? How do we end the abuse and torture that is happening at Guantanamo? So I think my question that I want to sort of start with is, how exactly do we do that? We talk about solidarity a lot within our movement spaces, and I think Guantanamo offers us a very sort of clear way to go about forging these relationships of solidarity, because there is so much at stake for so many communities in very visible ways. And so I think for all of us, I'd really like to think about, how can Guantanamo serve as a template for building solidarity across organizations, across movements, across communities? And then how do we take the lessons we learn from that space and apply it to other issues that are harming our communities?
I mean, thank you, Dr. Maha. Thank you all for that really rich introduction. I mean, we're talking about, and already you're hearing each of you speak to sort of similar pieces of this question and raising similar questions. What is the system, Mansour asked, that creates Guantanamo? What's that system? And Eric, you're saying, there are these systems, Guantanamo and otherwise, that divide people. You're curious about how the oppressions of communities are connected. And Maha builds on that to ask about, what does it look like to forge solidarity? And is Guantanamo potentially a template? And Jesse also, thinking about bringing in the immigration regime, talking about the racism and xenophobia and the ideologies that fuel that regime. And so we're getting at something deeper. We're getting at something that connects us. And, Jesse, when you're saying, to pierce the secrecy, then also sorts of invites, a deeper knowing, cross solidarity that could transform material realities. So I'm loving how we're moving already. Thank you for those really rich reflections. We're going to actually go and follow up on what Maha was saying about Guantanamo's origins. And we hope that, this is a moment for those of you who may not have heard this history to learn it, to share it, and also those who do know it, to just remember why it's important to tell the story from the beginning, or in the fullest way that we can, that we tell these narratives as much as we can. So, there are many places to begin the story of Guantanamo Bay and the US's relationship with the land that it stole from Cuba. I want to encourage folks to read a piece by Maha, recently published, and then I think we'll share in the chat, which traces a bit more of this history that you could share with others. But today we're going to focus on the use or misuse of the naval base as a site of indefinite detention. And this is for those that the US has demonized and deemed, criminal or dangerous. So we're going to start with Eric, and I'm going to ask if you can briefly trace the history of detention of migrants at Guantanamo, beginning in the 1990s. And the question, is what did Guantanamo offer to the Bush administration at that time?
Thanks, Nadia. And I hope other panelists can also weigh in with their knowledge. So in the 1990s, to answer your question, I'll say, what was the Bush administration confronted with? They were confronted with thousands and thousands of people showing up on the shores of Florida seeking refuge from persecution. That's what they were confronted with. Haiti at the time was being ruled by a dictator that had very strong historical connections to US involvement in the country, that also had ongoing connections with US agencies like the CIA, that the US was actively participating in helping to suppress so-called anti-communist forces. And even as early as the 1970s, people who were pro-democratic, who were fleeing persecution, started to try and get to the US to seek asylum by boat. Haiti is about 600 miles from Miami. That's about the same distance from where I grew up, Cincinnati, to New York City. It's far, but it's not that far. And so people, especially of limited financial means in Haiti, who were needing to flee that persecution, one of the only and the cheapest and best ways to get out was to take a boat and to try and get to Florida. Now, the US very early started encountering people in the 70s and 80s even. And Guantanamo Bay is actually a geographic sort of spot that's a good way for boaters to navigate from Haiti to Miami, to Florida. And so even in the 1970s, people were showing up in Guantanamo. There was still the army base there. And this was a phenomenon that was happening. At that point in time, US Army officials would give people directions. They'd help repair their ships. And because they felt like, we have to help save these people that might be drowning. And they'd even give them directions to Florida. But what started happening was this. In the 70s and 80s, as this started to begin more formalized, the US government noticed that the people that made it to the floors of Florida, that they all of a sudden had communities that were advocating for them. They had people that were watching the asylum interviews going on. They had attorneys that wanted to help people get refugee protection. And it was a problem for the US government because, one, politically, and this is a problem for the American people, Black people showing up looking for asylum on the US border, the US found that to be a political problem. And so the US politicians were looking for ways to get rid of that problem for themselves. And so they noticed that when people got to the shore, they became a political problem. They had more access to resources. They actually had access to the media. They could tell their own stories. But for people who never got to the US shore, who were on Guantanamo, the US government was able to do those interviews in silence. They were able to repatriate them, send them right back to Haiti without any lawyers, without any chance to tell their story. And so when the Bush administration in the early 90s has all these Haitians coming by boat to the US shores, they say, wait a second, I cannot let these people get to the shore. I'm going to create a prison on Guantanamo Bay so that we can send them right back to Haiti without any of these considering their legal rights. It was intentionally designed to take this group of people that they considered undesirable and keep them in a legal dark zone. And also, to Maha's point, not let them tell their story in the US space, not let them have access to be able to shape the public narrative. And so that the US could also, what it also offered the Bush administration was a way to launch their propaganda machine against the Haitian migrants and tell the story that they wanted to tell in a way that helps allow a political group to then justify what the state is doing.
Wow. The remarkable telling, and there's so much there about the why. And I'm going to turn to Mansour to keep us moving in this direction around the why. And if you could tell us the story of January 11th, 2002, and why Guantanamo was chosen as the site of indefinite detention.
Oh, thank you so much, Eric, for this informative answer. You know, I think on the 11th of January 2002, it was a turning point with Guantanamo become globally. And as you know, that George W. Bush administration announced a global war on terror targeting Muslim and Muslim communities. So Guantanamo is a product of the global war on terror policy that led to occupation, led to legalizing torture, kidnapping, legalizing CIA black site, drone attacks, and other things, either like inside the state or outside in other countries. And before, I would like to highlight one thing, which is talk about the black sites. I know because it's related to Guantanamo. You know, before many prisoners, including myself, before we were transferred to Guantanamo, we were taken to the CIA black site, where there, you know, what I have seen recently, the language they call it the custody of the CIA. They don't say the black site, which means it make it little like ambiguous, or at the same time eliminating the dark chapter of the black site where they, you know, the CIA contracted psychologists and torturer to develop what they call enhanced interrogation technique to Guantanamo. It was deliberately it's selected by George W. Bush to get Guantanamo outside of the law, outside the reach of the United States Constitution. It's a dark hole inside the military base in Guantanamo, where again secrecy. It's Guantanamo, one of the most secretive prisons in the world and the most expensive one. And you know, Guantanamo was selected, as I told you, that intentionally to deprive the prisoners of that right and to justify the United States actions, which is like a global war on terror. And it was a message to the Americans: we brought the worst of the worst. And secrecy gives them control over the narrative to shape people's opinions and way of thinking. When the General Mike Leonard was assigned to build Guantanamo, he built it in 96 hours. And before that, some of the cages he built, they already existed during the housing the Haitian migrants. So 2000, as I told you, 2002 was a turning point in Guantanamo history become global. The target, you know, was specifically housing Muslims, men and children. And I can say one of the things that might shock you all, that the youngest prisoner was a few months old. And I have been saying that over and over again until last month. I found a book, a testimony by one of the prisoners who were released early. They also mentioned in that book that there was a baby at Guantanamo. So Guantanamo, you know, George W. Bush administration indefinitely imprisoned prisoner of Guantanamo. The role of Guantanamo evolved and it changed in Guantanamo, and it turned to be an experimenting lab on prisoners. And by that, I can refer you to the research published by Seton Hall Law School titled Guantanamo, America's Battle Lab, where it based on the government document, how General Jeffrey Miller and military personnel turned Guantanamo experimenting and developing the torture technique in Guantanamo. So the purpose of Guantanamo, was to how to not detain, it just outside the law, because, to deprive the prisoners of that right, whether international right or whether Geneva Convention, or until that day, until today, prisoners at Guantanamo have no rights. So the role of Guantanamo keep evolving until today. It turned to be a political tool between the Republicans and the Democrats, used against each other, justify where the Republicans, turn it against the Democrats, showing how they soften terrorism, and the Democrats trying to show that they have more rights whatsoever.
Right.
This is the role of Guantanamo, around 800 men, and actually the number of prisoners at Guantanamo is unknown. It's estimation that what the government said, 779 prisoners, but the number higher than that. I can tell you this. Even what conversation with lawyers like Alka Pradhan, they say, yeah, the number more than that, because the government refuses to disclose all the names of the prisoners who are imprisoned in Guantanamo. Guantanamo rules not just start specifically to Guantanamo. It become a blueprint for many countries, creating their own Guantanamo, targeting not just what they call suspect terrorists, no, targeting activists, targeting opposition, targeting regime, targeting anyone who they don't like. So Guantanamo also gives some kind of encouragement, or some kind of green light for other government to create their own Guantanamo. Guantanamo now is everywhere. If we can look at it, it's many countries doing the same thing, where detaining people indefinitely, just link them to terrorism, and torturing them, and definitely imprisoning them. So that's what I can say about Guantanamo, the new phase of Guantanamo 2022.
Thank you. Wow. I mean, both of you are speaking, again, kind of in parallel, that it's about getting rid of a political problem. It's about suppressing a narrative. It's about experimentation. It's creating a blueprint. It's depriving rights in order to justify, policies. So we're hearing sort of, again, the threads throughout. And I want to ask Jesse and Maha, if both of you, maybe starting with you, Jesse, can touch on Guantanamo as a site outside of law, and also how you understand its evolution. So just both, what does that mean as a site outside of the law?
I'll go really briefly, because Eric covered so well the history of the MOC, the Migrant Operations Center. But just to note, so it's really important to note that this detention facility, it's used for people who've expressed fear of return, meaning they're asylum seekers, but because they are interdicted at sea, the administration refuses essentially to process their claims on U.S. soil. And so it's really impossible to know when people are interdicted at sea and transferred to the facility. It's incredibly hard to monitor whether they allowed to exercise the right to seek asylum. And it's really an egregious illustration of the discriminatory treatment and impunity that's endemic to the profit-driven U.S. immigration detention system. And so when people are picked up, from places like Cuba and Haiti, they're given a choice. They can either go back to their home country, or go to this Guantanamo facility, or try to find another country to take them in. But we don't know, that the government doesn't reveal what other countries people are sent to, and how often that occurs. And unlike other immigrants in the U.S. Detention system, you can't search for people who are detained there, so we don't have a list of people who are detained there. And my colleague Azadeh Irfani has worked a lot on this issue, and just wanted to note a report that she co-authored in 2021 with the organization Forward, that really gives a good background of this facility, and discusses how the U.S. consistently operates outside of compliance with regards to the Refugee Convention and Refugee Act of 1980, and in the way that it fails to uphold the rights of asylum seekers. And this is incredibly evident. It's really most evident with the Migrant Operations Center on Guantanamo Bay facility. And it was really this facility as well, this use of border externalization through the maritime interceptions that really pushed asylum seekers to cross by land through South America, Central America, to try to enter the U.S. And this has shifted focus towards the U.S.-Mexico southern border and border externalization through land. And so that's a bit of the history there, but I will pass there because Eric covered a lot.
That was great. Thank you. I want to just flag for folks the profit-driven immigration system, how the U.S. has consistently operated outside of compliance with international laws, and then just this transition then to what's the impact on other migration patterns and what to anticipate. Maha, is there anything else you want to add about Guantanamo as a site outside of the law?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about Guantanamo as outside of the law, specifically in the context of the war on terror, I mean, there are a lot of ways in which the U.S. government created it as such through, for example, a memo from the Office of Legal Counsel, where they specifically indicated that they were choosing Guantanamo because of the fact that the federal district court could not properly exercise habeas jurisdiction over people held at Guantanamo. Of course, this was based on precedent in terms of, those who had been held previously at Guantanamo. So that was, when we think about, I think it's a place of exclusion, right? It was something that was designed from the beginning to be that way. It wasn't something that defaulted into exclusion. The other thing is, as Mansour mentioned, right, these prisoners were also designated as unlawful enemy combatants, which basically expelled them from protections that were granted by the Geneva Conventions. And so they were subjected to torture. And when it came to torture, right, we know from the torture memos, some of which were released by the Obama administration, that, for example, in order for treatment behavior to be considered torture, it had to rise to the level of organ failure or death. And so all of these mechanisms that were put in place were to really expel Muslims from the category of human and from the category, therefore, of anyone who deserves rights. Now, I just want to mention a couple other things because of my focus on narrative. So, for example, when the first Muslim men were brought to Guantanamo, they were described as so dangerous by then General Richard Myers that they would gnaw through hydraulic lines in the back of a C-17 to bring it down. And he said, so these are very, very dangerous people, and that's how they're being treated, right? And we also know that they were considered the worst of the worst, right? And it's interesting because when it came to later trying to transfer the men out of the prison, Lee Wolosky, who was this former special envoy for the closure of Guantanamo under the Obama administration, blamed that characterization of the men on the difficulty in getting them countries to accept them as transfers. What he didn't mention is that the US government had created that construction and that the Obama administration had done nothing to challenge that construction. And so the last thing I'll say is, there have been a number of cases, right, that have been, one in the Supreme Court where the men at Guantanamo could challenge their detention, but there was nothing really that materialized from that. So one of the most powerful statements in this regard was from Juma al-Dusari. Perhaps I'm sure Mansour knows him. He was a Bahraini prisoner who was detained for 5 years and survived multiple suicide attempts. And in my book, I write about this. He recalled the impact of the Rasul v. Bush Supreme Court decision on his case, saying, quote, One day, the military gave me a piece of paper that laid out the allegations against me. I had been in Guantanamo at that point for 2.5 years. My lawyer later told me that I had received this paper as a result of a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that detainees were allowed to have court hearings. We never got the promised hearings. Instead, we went through military hearings at Guantanamo, in which we were not shown any evidence or allowed to have lawyers. All we got was the piece of paper. So even when they were theoretically supposed to be included in some mechanism of legal recourse, it was ultimately a facade. So again, entrenching the idea that they were going to be and continue to be excluded from the law.
Wow, thank you, Maha. We're going to get into sort of, again, this logic of exclusion, and you've said it in really incredible ways. To expel Muslims from humanity, from being human, is to expel them from rights. You'll see this sort of expulsion of migrants from these categories in order to suspend human rights and constitutional protections, or attempt to suspend dignity itself. Just to note that, Maha and others have said this was created as such. Maha, you said, this is not an anomaly. This is not broken. This is a system that is designed and is functioning exactly as it was intended. And so we need to think about that. One, the possibility of designing such systems that completely degrade our collective humanity. We're going to transfer a bit to, speaking about Guantanamo today, the men who remain, the migrants who are there, and then how we might move into what we anticipate the evolution or Guantanamo of tomorrow. But, again, we saw the transfer of 11 men last week, but there are now 15 men who remain imprisoned. And at the same time, the Migrant Operations Center, or MOC, is continuing to detain mostly Haitian migrants in prison-like conditions with, as Jesse and Eric have said, little transparency and accountability. So what do we need to know about Guantanamo right now? And what does it tell us about the Guantanamo of tomorrow? So Mansour, I'll start with you. Can you tell us about the 15 men who remain, and also share something about the status of those who have been released?
Well, if we started to talk about life after Guantanamo, it's a difference. We need like one session. But what I can tell you that the men who were released to Oman, I have been in contact with a few of them. So far, the Omani government put them in some kind of transition facility where they allowed to talk to their families, but still, Oman, from my experience with the first group that were sent to Oman treated them well, but they had no legal status, which was really problematic, which Oman last year came to the former Guantanamo detainees and told them, you have 2 weeks, you have to leave Oman, you have to leave the country. And that was devastation because men had lived there, established their life, their families, become productive members, jobs, and so on. And imagine just 2 weeks, leave now with your families, with their kids. And they were all sent back to Yemen. And they now experience a lot of difficulties, challenges, and arrest, and you name it. So with the new group, I think Oman will do the same thing. They will, house them maybe for 2 or 3 years. I don't know for how long. And they will deport them back to Yemen. I don't see the point. The United States call it resettlement. With the agreement between the Omani government and the United States, it's a resettlement agreement, basically. But there is no, from those hosting countries, there is no fulfillment of this kind of agreement because it is a classified. Again, it is secrecy. And secrecy are being weaponized and misused and abused to deprive those former prisoners of their right. So in one case particular, that's the Tunisian prisoner who was released to Tunisia, and he's missing now. We are trying to track him down. I have sent an email to State Department. There is no answer. I have been working with Amnesty International, with the ICRC, trying to find him and to know how he's treated, because in 2005 he was sentenced to 20 years in absentia in prison, because some prisoners giving a statement about him. Based on the statement, he was sent to 20 years without legal representation, without him being there, and yet he was sent to Tunisia. What's the deal between the United States and the Tunisian government? It's unknown. It's classified. As for the remain prisoners in Guantanamo, as you know, 15 prisoners remain at Guantanamo. 3 of them cleared for release, and 3 and it's funny because I laughed, because I think it is the first time in history you could hear forever prisoners. I mean, I don't see for my research and asking, have any people in history classified as forever prisoners? And those include Abu Zubaydah, and Abu Zubaydah is the most tortured prisoner in the CIA history, and they don't want to release him because what they have done to him. And you have 2 convictions, and you have 7 in military commissions. And I will let Maha Hilal to talk about the military commissions. It's a broken system. So what the U.S. government, they created what's so-called the military commission. It's like a hybrid between civil court and military court. It's a broken system that allows the government to use evidence obtained by torture, confession under torture, and to use classified evidence. Even the lawyers cannot see them. So it is a broken system that allows government to, again, to practice and to violate the human right, to violate the international law, to violate the American Constitution itself. So this is what we know about Guantanamo today. Is Biden's going to close it? No. Is he able? Yes. If he wants to, he can close it today, now, tomorrow. Yes, he can do it. But there is a lack of political will to close Guantanamo. Future of Guantanamo. Should I talk about the future of Guantanamo?
We'll get there in.
Okay.
Yes, but thank you so much. I mean, this concept too of why might we need forever prisoners. What does that mean, and what are the stories that need to be told? Thank you for sharing that. Jesse, I want to turn to you about the migrants who are held at the Migrant Operations Center. What is the Biden administration's latest contract? Tell us about the intentions to grow and sustain that facility.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'll start with the contracts, which do say a lot in terms of where the incentive comes from to detain people in this facility. It's very much profit driven. Last August, the Biden administration, we know, signed a contract for over 160 million to maintain the operations center with a company called Akima Infrastructure Protection. This company that is based in Florida, but that was part of a bigger contract for this company with ICE. So this company operates ICE detention facilities, as contracts for ICE detention facilities throughout the country, and now has this contract with the Guantanamo Bay facility. ICE also has a contract with the company MVM Inc. This is a Virginia-based contractor that might sound familiar to a lot of people. It has a really dark history of contracting with the CIA, the DoD, and of course with DHS. In 2018, this contractor was exposed for its role in transporting separated children during the family separation crisis. There were some exposés by Reveal Media about this. It continues to get lucrative contracts from ICE to provide guards for these facilities. And then the contract, the company Geo Group for many years held the contract for the Migrant Operations Center. It's worth noting that this company, one of the biggest private prison companies in the world, The current nominee for the U.S. Attorney General was formerly a lobbyist for this company. Pam Bondi, who's a Florida former state attorney general, was a lobbyist for this company, and is now seeking, has been nominated for the attorney general for the U.S. government. So we can really see, start to see where this incentive comes from in terms of this private-based detention, this privately operated detention system. In terms of what we know about how many people are there and treatment, there's been a couple of exposés last year. Drop Site News and also New York Times had some reporting about some of the conditions and about how many people are being detained there. And then we also know from some of the contracts. So we know from 1996 to 2015, there were over 400 migrants sent from the facility to third countries, according to the State Department. Between in 2021 and 22, there were around 20 migrants a day held at the facility. DHS has told the media that there were 37 migrants held there from 2020 to 2023. So the data is a little bit murky, but we do know people still are continued to be held there. As of February of last year, there were 4 migrants held there, according to DHS. And then on the conditions, there was an investigation where inspectors from the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties went to the facility in 2023, and based on complaints filed by advocacy groups, and found serious cause for concern and recommended several things. One was that they stop hold children there, and then bring families to the U.S. to be processed rather than bringing people there. And there have been other exposés documenting just absolutely deplorable treatment, including the use of blackout goggles that people are forced to wear during transport, lack of access to calls, to communicate with lawyers, and just awful conditions. I'll pause there.
Thank you, Jesse. And there's resonance, of course, just encouraging folks, as Jesse just did, to follow the money, to name actors, in part because you start seeing that these actors are, Eric, you were mentioning this, like maybe we find that they are common actors, and indeed we do, and individuals. And I think also, as we're imagining the world that we deserve, remembering that the current world that we have is designed and imagined by only a few people. And so what does that invite us to do? Eric, how do you, building on what Jesse shared, make sense of MOC, the Migrant Operations Center, within the US government's broader approach to migration, and specifically consideration or not of international law?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So how do I make sense of it? I think the Migrant Operations Center, particularly as we're talking about it coming out of a particular relationship with the Haitian community and with the idea of a free, self-determining, powerful Haiti, I think that's where I want to kind of focus in on. Why something Mansour said really struck me. He was talking about how Abu Zaida, they have tortured him more than anyone, and they don't want to release him because they don't want people to know what they've done. I think Haiti, as the first and really only nation state to base itself in the abolition of racial slavery and the transatlantic slave trade in 1804, that it has been being tortured by the global powers, the former colonial power France, and then the US, since it decided to do that. The US didn't recognize Haiti for almost 60 years. And that's partly because we have to remember the US based itself in excluding African people from legal protections. It based itself in an economy, a political order where African people could be brutalized, used as cheap labor with no legal recourse. And let's remember, that wasn't just about African people, right? That was a conception of civilized and savage that was based in sort of a something we're seeing a resurgence of very much now, Christian white nationalism, that thought of indigenous people, African people, Muslim people as not deserving legal protection, not deserving human rights, self-determination, all that stuff. And so part of the reason that when we talked about the Migrant Operations Center being useful to the Bush administration, later the Clinton administration, all these different US administrations, is that it allowed them to isolate the Haitian problem from US political consciousness. It allowed them to cover up the fact that the US has actually been fundamentally involved in propping up the dictators, supporting the dictators who would suppress the majority of the Haitian people that wanted a free, strong, democratic Haiti, because that was in the US interest. The US did not want and does not want a strong, powerful Haiti. Also because the US is sitting atop like wealth and power that has been gained through colonialism, slavery, genocide, in the US and around the world, across the global South, in Palestine. I mean, and so, you know, I also started out in the domestic carceral system, and the US leads in that like no other. And that also we see was in response to the freeing of Black people and the civil rights movement. That's when mass incarceration really took off in the United States. The carceral system is about social control. And so when I look at like the Migrant Operations Center, Guantanamo, all how that's working, it's just like a fundamental pillar in this real work of the US of sitting atop this privilege that was gained through colonialism and slavery, and not really addressing it, redistributing wealth gained, giving up actors like Citibank, who you know, we learned that Citibank was a huge motivating factor in why the U.S. invaded Haiti in 1915 and military occupied them formally for 15, I think almost 17 years, about the same formal occupation of Afghanistan, about the same time period. And in that time, it did that to seize $500 million worth of gold from Haiti and give it to Citibank in New York. And this has never been repaid. And so that's the kind of actor that Guantanamo, the Migrant Operations Center, this whole carceral system is protecting. And that's what we hopefully can, by taking a key cog out, can help dismantle.
Oof, Eric, thank you for bringing us back to the origin of this country. Mansour, when we were on just kind of prepping for this call, you know, Mansour is looking at the state of our political system and has said, you know, what is wrong with the United States? Eric is reminding us, the truth tellers on this call are reminding us what is wrong is an original wrong of indigenous genocide, of the kidnapping and enslavement of African people, and that ideology sort of, and the suppressing of that history being sort of a crucial part of understanding some of these kind of current iterations of policy. Maha, you know, as we're kind of ending this section of the webinar and thinking about Guantanamo, you know, Guantanamo's role, and so much of your writing has focused on the institutionalization of Islamophobia through the war on terror. So I want us to just bring that into the space and that knowledge into the space, how Guantanamo has served as a model as well for sites of detention, and and broadly just sort of linking us as we transfer into, what is the future we deserve, which we want to talk about. Just again, making it clear the link between some of this ideology of exclusion to policies and infrastructure like Guantanamo.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nadia, for that question. Like I mentioned in the beginning, Guantanamo was sort of my first introduction to the targeting of Muslims in the war on terror in a sort of extremely visceral way. And when I look at and analyze Guantanamo in the sort of trajectory of the war on terror, to me, it has served as one of the most emblematic examples of institutionalized Islamophobia. And the ways that the Muslim men and boys were captured, right, from giving bounties, providing bounties to individuals in different countries to basically turn in their family, their friends, members of their community, to the ways in which the torture of these men and boys was justified, is an example of Islamophobia, right? When we look at the ways that systems of oppression operate, you're never going to see an offshore prison for white Christian men, because that just won't happen, right? There would be a revolt in this country if that were to happen, right? And we can see that with, for example, the people who've been detained in January 6th. A lot of times we hear about the conditions in which they're detained. And if you compare them to the ways in which our communities are detained, it's like staying at the Ritz-Carlton. There's no comparison. And the reason is because there are groups that you can do this to, because of the way that they've been ostracized and excluded. And Islamophobia operates precisely to do that in the war on terror. And I think one of the other things that I think is really important is, given that Guantanamo is one of the earliest relics of the war on terror, the way I also see it is sort of this place that extended the boundary of what would be justified treatment of Muslims, right? And so not only do we see the most horrific torture happening at Guantanamo, it also then serves to make what happens to Muslims in other parts of the war on terror or other through modes of violence elsewhere in the war on terror seem a lot more benign, when in reality it's all violence. Guantanamo is also not just a place, it's an idea. And this idea has been very entrenched in Muslims across the globe because of the war on terror. I've been in Muslim communities for as long as I've been alive. And, post 9/11, I've heard a lot of Muslims say, I don't want to say this, I don't want to do this because I might end up in Guantanamo. Whether or not the threat is real, depending on your citizenship status, for example, the idea that it occupies this space in the minds of Muslims is really important and really emblematic of how deeply it has penetrated and traumatized Muslims in the United States and across the globe. And in terms of Guantanamo's sort of serving as this blueprint, right, we know that many individuals from Guantanamo, including most prominently Jeffrey Miller, went from Guantanamo to Iraq specifically to, quote, Gitmoize Iraq, right? And we saw what happened. We saw what happened with Abu Ghraib, in which, again, the most brutal torture was used on Iraqi prisoners. We also know, for example, that there are at least two, I think there's now three, communication management units in the United States, in Terre Haute, Indiana, and Marion, Illinois. And these two communication management units have been nicknamed Little Gitmo or Little Guantanamo because of the restrictive conditions in which those incarcerated exist that mimic a lot of what is happening at Guantanamo. Not to mention, when they were both first created, they housed an exclusively Muslim population. It was only after there was scrutiny on these two units that they began moving in other incarcerated people to sort of diminish the facade that this wasn't about targeting Muslims specifically. So, I think when we look at Guantanamo, just in general, I think it's really an important site to continue, even if the prison is closed, right? To look at its impact, because again, as an idea, it still lives on, not just in the psyche of Muslims, generally speaking, but also when it comes to survivors that have to live after Guantanamo and are faced with the stigma of being deemed a terrorist.
Thank you, Maha. I hope folks are just taking all of this in. Thank you to this remarkable panel. When you say there are groups that you can do this to because of how they've been demonized, dehumanized, let that be a call to us whenever that is happening. What is possible when we dehumanize people is the gravest atrocities, the gravest of crimes. We're witnessing that now. We've been witnessing that throughout our history. It expands the boundary of this kind of dehumanization and treatment. And so we're watching that. And I want us to turn, because we must, to the future that we deserve. And I want to encourage folks, if you have a question, please put it in the chat wherever you're signing on. Again, we're following that and we're happy to answer some of those questions. But many of you listening, and we're seeing some of you in the chat, hello, have been part of the long fight to close Guantanamo and to protect our communities from the brutality that this idea represents. And we're entering an even more dangerous time. And so a question for all of the panelists is, how do we strengthen our solidarity in the coming years? How do we build the strongest coalition for all that is ahead? The administration, the influence of oligarchic power that really is trying to suspend all of the norms and all of the processes that might even mitigate the harm of states. So we need to strengthen ourselves to fight for the world that we and our children deserve. So to Maha, I'll start with Maha, then Jesse, Eric, and then we'll end with Mansour. And then we'll take some questions if you have any, but we also have something that we would like to share that Maha has written. And so we hope you'll stay, ask some questions. But Maha, as you think to the future we deserve, how do we strengthen our solidarity?
Yeah, I think this conversation is one critical step. And, we've had similar conversations in the past on January 11th and throughout the year. And so I think, finding points of intersection where there are, again, communities that are experiencing the same violence in the same location, I think provides us with a space from which to organize and build relationships. And I think building relationships is the most important part. And not just superficial relationships, like really getting to know each other and the places from which we come, our backgrounds, because we have to be invested in each other's well-being and the communities from which we come from in order to show up in spaces. We know that the state is leveraging violence against us all the time, and it's overwhelming. And what brings us to other spaces and other movements is a deep care and concern for other communities. And, one last thing I'll say is, I was at a conference on closing military bases in Cuba in 2015. And interestingly enough, no one at the conference brought up Guantanamo Bay prison. And I was quite surprised. And so I asked them, can we just mention it briefly? And I think for all intents and purposes, the Cubans who were at the conference thought, this is not really our problem, insofar as it's the U.S. committing these human rights abuses. But I thought it was sort of a really interesting moment to bring the prison into the space and to consciously think about who is being targeted, right? And how do we need to protect these communities? When we talk about the military bases, right, there are people living there. There are people that are being violently subjugated to oppression. So how do we bring these communities into the rooms that we're in, right? And how do we draw the connections? I know when the Muslim ban came out, for example, a lot of Japanese Americans were quick to show their solidarity because they had experienced, right, internment in this country. So also learning from each other's history and, in fact, learning from our own histories so that we can forge these deeper relationships.
Thank you, Maha. Jesse, how do we strengthen our solidarity?
I think, adding to Maha's great synopsis of that, I think there are very few actions and community events that I'm at in the area that Maha is not at. So I know that following Dr. Maha's lead is pretty central. And So of course, yeah, I think the mutual solidarity efforts are really pivotal. I agree that our, building up relationships are essential. I think one area that where there's a lot of room to grow is around looking at budgets, how government budgets are used, and centering a lot of advocacy through mobilizing with community groups and mobilizing with NGOs, but a lot of community organizing to push on government budgets and to not allow it to be the norm where there are just billions and billions spent on enforcement and militarism and immigration enforcement, and peanuts really spent on healthcare and climate needs and health and education. So I think organizing to push back on that, mobilizing and advocating with members of Congress, but also at the local level around budgets, and divestment campaigns also, I think, are so pivotal to look at these companies that are benefiting from these enforcement militaristic programs and advocating for divestment from these companies.
Amazing. Thank you, Jesse. Eric, to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I agree with everything that Dr. Maha and Jesse shared. Just would put another plug in for the trans-border collaboration. I think in our theory of change, we have a hope that people in the United States who have proximity to the US political system and power, that the degree to which we who are experiencing internal US oppression can connect that to all the global oppression that is a result of the same systems, and can we collaborate and connect so that we can use our proximity to help undo from closer within the things that are affecting people in Haiti and Yemen and all across the globe. So what does that look like? How does that happen in this era of like mass communication and mass information sharing? Can we seize this moment? That's the hope.
Beautiful. Thank you. Mansour, the last word here, how do we strengthen the work? Yes.
Basically, they already said everything, which is, education, which you need to educate each other, educating the young generation. As you know, the student in the United States, for example, in many different parts of the world, they play an important role against genocide and so on. And coordination, collaboration, because I believe that keeping silence, it's only serve the oppressor. It's another form of oppression too. So we need to mobilize. We need to. There's nowadays it's easier with the social media, with communication to connect, to collaborate, but it's actually awareness. We need to spread awareness, educate the people, and questioning and criticizing the government policies. It's really, really important, because the government, all the time try to cover their abuses and misuses of power and money and so on. So I don't think I have anything to add to what they have said. It's the same thing.
It was perfect. It is to tell the truth, to not keep silent, to educate each other, thinking about trans-border collaborations, mutual solidarity, looking at the money, the budgets, divesting, withdrawing our consent, bringing communities into the room, learning from each other's history, insisting on our own history. Thank you all so much. I want to invite us to answer just 2 quick questions and then turn to a litany where I hope, if you're listening, you can find a place that is comfortable where you could just close your eyes and be with us in a moment as we walk through. But there were 2 questions, one about what Biden can do in the coming days. Thank you, Richard, for that question. And as Mansour said, Biden can do a lot. Biden could close the prison. Will Biden do it? Is the question. Is there political will? Biden should transfer.
Richard, one of the most active Gitmo coalition in Guantanamo case. Yes.
We're so glad you're here.
So he has been doing a lot of work. Thank you, Richard, for everything you do. Basically, Biden in the next few days, he's not going to close Guantanamo. Of course, he could if he can, but at least he can release the cleared prisoner and the forever prisoners and get the deal done with the plea deal done. That's the least he can do before he leaves the White House.
Exactly. Transfer the 6 remaining uncharged men, 3 who've been approved for transfer, standing down on the habeas cases for those who are left if he's not closing the prison. There's work that can be done. We're going to put some demands in the chat. There's a question quickly for you, Maha, about the units in Marion, Illinois.
I believe they are still open. And I also would actually refer you to CCR because they've done actually, I think, the most work on communication management units. And there's also, we can send a follow-up email of a new communication management unit that a group of researchers uncovered and reported on.
You know, we're joined by really remarkable activists and organizers and people who've been with us and journeying with us for such a long time. So thank you. We're going to turn now. Yeah, Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, Biden could also completely alter and change the migrant introduction and detention program if he wanted. This is, for the most part, controlled by executive order. And the executive order could be issued tomorrow that changes it, that says people are allowed refugee protections at sea. You could even say we are going to bring everyone to a port in Florida and process people there. That could happen. Will they do it? No, but it's possible.
It's an extraordinary amount of power. Thank you, Eric. Thank you all so much. Again, if you want to just find a space, we're going to walk through a litany that Maha wrote a number of years ago called "Together We Will Abolish Guantanamo," a litany for freedom. So sit back and try to absorb. And the refrain at the end of each paragraph is "Together we will abolish Guantanamo." If you are able, I would encourage you to say that aloud wherever you are.
And yeah, Nicole's going to share it. Okay. So today we gather from different locations around the world to commemorate the 23 years that Guantanamo Bay prison has been used to house war on terror prisoners. We remember the land on which the prison is based, illegally occupied Cuban land that has been used by the U.S. to inflict massive violence. We recognize the violence of attributing the name Guantanamo to a horrendous prison that has been used to steal and destroy lives, instead of a city with a vibrant people, culture, and society. Together, we will abolish Guantanamo.
We reckon with the knowledge that Guantanamo is a manifestation of U.S. empire, where vulnerable and marginalized bodies are and have been surveilled, controlled, tortured, and killed in order to preserve power, hegemony, and endless war. These are wars that are marked on the bodies of prisoners and tethered to the countries from which they originate. Together, we will abolish Guantanamo.
We remember that before the War on Terror, Guantanamo was used as a site to detain Haitian refugees fleeing the violence of a military coup that overthrew Haiti's democratically elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a coup that the U.S. helped facilitate. Instead of accepting Haitian refugees, the U.S. government prevented many from reaching U.S. borders, sending them to Guantanamo instead to be processed in the absence of U.S. legal protections. We continue to reject the ongoing threats to send Haitian migrants to Guantanamo and the precarity and violence that comes with it. We also remember that Cuban refugees who were detained at Guantanamo a few years later, refugees who fled from violence in their own country only to be detained by the U.S. and imprisoned at a military base on their own soil. Together, we will abolish Guantanamo.
We reflect on the fact that Guantanamo is not just a physical location, but the idea that certain lives are disposable and undeserving of justice. In the last 23 years of the war on terror, those who have been subjected to these logistics of Guantanamo have all been Muslim men and boys. We stand witness to this injustice and categorically reject the U.S. commitment to a version of national security built on the dehumanization of Muslims. Together we will abolish Guantanamo.
Today we gather to mourn the detention, past and present, of the Muslim men and boys at Guantanamo and the reality of their detention, sorrowfully expressed by former prisoner Nizar Sassi, who, when asked to define the prison, responded, quote, "If you want a definition of this place, you don't have the right to have rights." We also mourn the deaths of 9 Muslim men who died at Guantanamo, men whose stories have been buried with the truth about the US's violence. Together, we will abolish Guantanamo.
Together, we gather to affirm our support for the rights of Guantanamo prisoners, past and present, rights that have often only ever existed on paper that could not and cannot cut walls, bars, or any other barrier to true freedom. Together, we will abolish.
We denounce the faux legal system that has rendered Muslim prisoners summarily guilty, including those who remain detained at Guantanamo and those who have been released. Rather than adjudicating prisoners' cases on the possibility that they could ever be innocent, they're instead adjudicated on the basis of how much of an imagined threat that they pose to the United States. Together, we will abolish Guantanamo.
We challenge the construction of Muslim prisoners as inherently violent and terroristic constructions that the United States has used to justify and legitimize the infliction of egregious state violence at Guantanamo and beyond. Together, we will abolish Guantanamo.
We stand in solidarity with prisoners' resistance and their fight for autonomy, self-determination, and an end to the injustice that has forced so many to the edge of death in order to reclaim life. Regardless of the lengths to which the US government has gone to criminalize the men at Guantanamo, our solidarity means that we will walk with these prisoners this length back until there is true justice and justice for Muslims. Together, we will abolish Guantanamo.
As we continue the struggle to close Guantanamo, we know that its closure alone cannot rectify the injustice it has continued to cause for those still detained. We also know that even if Guantanamo is closed, this chapter of US violence is far from over. It lives on in the lives of those who have been released and who the government has altogether abandoned and callously disregarded. No matter how the US has marked these men, we bear witness to their courage and spirit, especially in daring to hold close to their Muslim identity, the reason that they were targeted in the first place. Together, we will abolish Guantanamo.
Today, we close by collectively renewing our commitment to challenge, confront, and disrupt the violence that is and has always been part of Guantanamo Bay Prison. We do so with a deep sense of hope, not that the US government will do the right thing, but that we, the people, will shift the tide so far forward that there is no other choice but to reckon with and end this catastrophic project of the war on terror. We know our liberation is inextricably wound up with that of our brothers, and we will fight for their freedom until there are no shackles, chains, or bars that separate us. And then we will hear freedom ring. Together, we will abolish Guantanamo.
Thank you, Maha, for that. Thank you all. Thank you to the co-organizers, to Amnesty International, Muslim Counterpublics Lab, the National Immigrant Justice Center. Thank you to our interpreters, to our stage manager, Nicole Nimri, to our panelists. I also want to give a thank you to the CCR team for inspiring me with your remarkable, steadfast work. To Pardis, Wells, Shane, Ibrahim, Aliyah, and to the memory of Michael Ratner, to those who have joined the Guantanamo Bar, to those who are listening now, to this movement that is growing and growing until freedom for all of us. Thank you so much to the audience for being here. Again, it was an honor. I hope that this conversation inspired you, that you are ready to continue the fight. We are humbled to be in the struggle together and fortified by your presence and by your work. Thank you all so much for being here.